All right, so morning everybody. Welcome to week 3. Looking at the quiz this weekend and the amount of people that wrote, I see our numbers have fallen like drastically from like over 30 people who were registered to 21 who wrote last week to 14 people who wrote this weekend. So please don't drop off. People, please stay. These first 2 weeks were a bit rough and there was quite a lot of reading, and I think getting into the JPA mindset is probably a bit difficult, but I wouldn't say it's going to be downhill from here, but like next weekend or this coming week, next week's test will be a lot easier and a lot less like reading for the next few weeks, so don't drop off. Stay strong. All right, so we had, like I said, we had 14 people who wrote this weekend. Average was 62%, so it came up by about 11%. So that's good. That means it's a passing average, because you have to get 61% to pass the certification exam. And one person actually got 100% as well, so it's not impossible. And it's not the same person as the previous week. So if you're going to look at the bottom 3 questions, you can see it's the question 9, 21.43%. So that's what, like 3 people got that right, that one right. Just open and into Explorer. So that's question 9. And the bottom 3 questions, the points weren't great, but it was really the bottom 3. After that, most of the other questions most people got right. And this one is, which of the following are true regarding a JPA2 entity class? And I think the thing, and it looks like the thing that caught most of you guys out was the stop one. The entity class must be annotated with the entity annotation. So that's not true, because remember you can also specify it in your mapping classes and in your persistence XML as an entity class. So most people got this one wrong because they picked that one. Second one, an entity class must have a no constructor, must not have any constructor other than the public no arguments constructor. So that's false. It must have a no public no arguments constructor, but it can have any other constructor as well. It must be a top level entity, top level class. So it must be an abstract class. As Donald, must be an abstract class, or a normal class can't be an interface or an enum or something like that. Entity class may be final. The rule specification specifically says it mustn't be final. And then it needs to be serializable when you detach it. So if you look at the correct answers there, it must be a top-level class, it must be serializable. So I think the thing that caught most people out was the top one. The entity class must be annotated for an entity annotation, which there isn't true. Then the second one, I also need to refer back to this question 7. And yeah, this one, I'd actually expect this one to have been the bottom one. This one sort of looks at it's primary key I'm looking for here. Compound primary keys, so primary key consists of multiple fields. So though we didn't specifically look at it in the class, hopefully you picked up in the reading. So we're actually we'll be looking at compound primary keys like in the last week. But the main thing that it is that we can have primary keys consist of multiple fields. So the top one would have been false. And then there's some other rules, but so we're going to do this in the last week. We'll go over this. So the correct answer is must be serializable, must write the equals and hashcode methods appropriately. The reason for that is because it's going to be using that primary key as an identifier. It needs to be able to actually compare and say, well, is this primary key unique or this entity unique using that primary key? And the other one was properly based access issues. The properties of the primary key must be public or protected. So it doesn't actually matter if it's a primary key type class or not. Any properties, if you use property based access, it must be public or protected. It can't be private. I was actually talked to Rory, because at the moment we're actually marking the review quizzes that if you have anything wrong, you get 0. You have to have everything right. So I'll chat with Rory. Might just change it so at least if you've got one of like 2 or 3 answers on the multiple choice ones correct, that you actually get like half a mark. And then the last one, question 10. And this is also so persistent fields of an entity class must be public, private, protected. So pretty much must must be anything. So it mustn't be public. So it's not that the provider isn't going to work, but the best practice in the way that the specification says must be is it mustn't be public. So it'll be everything except public. So persistent fields of any class must be. So this must be is what you sort of need to look out for there. Is false. So that's the answer is false. So obviously the people that are wrong say true. So and so most of the other questions, like it was pretty high, the average. All right, so let's get, if there's no questions. Nope. Okay, so if we get into this week's topic, which is understanding the entity manager. It almost sounds like a psychology class. You know, we're going to put the entity manager on the couch then, we're going to ask the entity manager, you know, tell me about your mother and your father. Not so much. So we, once again, looking at how entity manager fits in with persistent context and persistent unit, like we did in the first week. Then looking at the different types of entity managers, being the container managed or application managed entity managers, and how they fit in with persistence and the different transactions. And looking at the, well, they say describe the entity lifecycle. And we're looking at the entity lifecycle. It's not just the entity lifecycle, but how the entity manager manages the entities through their life cycle, and specifically also at detached and merged entities. So looking at the persistent context, and that's sort of a very similar little diagram in the first week. So your persistent context is configured by a persistence unit. So if you recall from last week, persistent unit, when it starts up, it sort of goes and looks and sees, listening which classes are in my persistence unit, and that's either picked up via annotations based on where the root of your persistence unit is, the XML from your mapping files, the classed elements in your persistence XML, and that sort of gets all put into a persistence unit. And then your persistent context sort of puts a little boundary around these. So whenever you need to manage an entity, so let's say we actually want to persist or roll back or do something with this entity, you have to put it inside the persistent context, and that's when we call about that entity is being managed. And to interact with that persistent context, we use the entity manager or the entity manager interface. So just look at that. We've got a persistent context. It's configured by a persistence unit. It contains our entities based on the persistence unit, and we use our entity manager to interact with the persistent context. So you're never going to have a persistent context dot something method. It'll always be your entity manager dot something to manage it. And when it comes to ORMs, it's a sort of this persistent context that I wouldn't say is its downfall, but it's, if you don't understand how it works and where it fits in, when it gets started, when it ends, it's when things get complicated, especially when you're working with different stateful and stateless beans and singleton beans. This is the type of thing that can bite you. So not just for the certification exam, but also just for in general, for working with JPA, it's important that you sort of understand where the persistent context fits in, when it starts, when it ends, how it interacts with transactions. And I'm probably not going to be able to touch on everything you need to know for this. So the chapter 6 in the JPA book actually has a good explanation. You can go through the examples there if you want to sort of really get into it. So I'm going to try and educate as much as I can about this, but I really recommend you sort of really study chapter 6. Using this knowledge of the persistent context and the entity managers that manages them, we've got 3 different types of entity managers. So so 2 main ones, and then the one's got 2 different ones. So we've got container managed entity managers. So as the name says, it's managed by a container, so it's in your Java EE environments. And that sort of is obtained through injection by using your @persistent context annotation to inject that. So if I just gonna open up the demo here, I'm just gonna put on presentation mode so you can just see. So that'll be like the persistence unit there where wrong one. Persistent context there. So we actually inject it for giving it the unit name, and then we get our entity manager that way. From last week, we were looking at like our SE type things. We actually got it by using this persistence entity create entity factory. All right, so whenever we work within a container, we can use this persistent context to inject that entity manager into our beans. So, as the name says, it's managed by the container, and if it's container managed, it means it's going to be dependent on your JTA transactions. So your Java transaction API. That's all that XA type stuff and the other interface. And if you haven't worked with EJBs before, you didn't do the EJB certification course, there is a chapter 3 in the JPA 2 book, which I recommend you read. And also, we did this in week 10 of the EJB course. So if you go to my YouTube channel, where we actually upload these ones as well, week 10 for the EJB stuff, there's a whole hour about transactions and JTA and how that works. So if you're not familiar with it, I really recommend you go and read it, because otherwise this isn't going to make sense to you at all. So looking at the container managed entities, you get two varieties of that. So the first one is transaction scoped, and the one is extended. So it's the scope. So how long is our entity manager or persistent context going to live? So transaction scope is linked to the actual active JTA transaction. So when this transaction starts and when it ends, that's how long our entity manager or persistent context is going to live. So we're going to look at this later on today, but when an entity manager, when a persistent context sort of dies or finishes, it means that all the entities that were inside that persistent context are unmanaged. So they're not going to, so they become detached. So that's just an important thing to remember, is that whenever the persistent context is gone, all the entities that were managed by that persistent context aren't managed by it anymore. So it's like they're just normal objects. They're not going to be persisted. They're not going to be rolled back. When you update them, nothing's going to be updated in the database. So transaction scope, like I said, starts whenever there's an active JTA transaction that we start up the entity manager or inject it into your bean. If it's an active JTA transaction, either from another bean that's calling it or servlet, or if that bean creates its own transaction, that's when the entity manager starts up. And it ends when that transaction gets committed or rolled back. Then the other one is the extended container managed entity manager. The reason for having the extended one is when we have a stateful bean, and when you're using a stateful bean, you're going to have some sort of conversational state between that bean and its clients. So you don't want to have that bean go and commit every single time you make a call to that stateful bean, because that's what's going to happen with normal transaction scoped container managers. So you want that sort of bean to sort of only commit once you're saying it to commit, and when it is going to commit is when you actually close that stateful bean. So when you call the remove method, or whatever method has got the remove annotation on it. So if none of this makes sense to you, go and read chapter 3 of the Pro JPA book, or go and look at week 10 of the EJB course on YouTube. The last one that we've seen a bit of already is the application managed entity manager. So this is the only one you can use in the SE environment, your Java standard edition. You can also use the application managed entity manager in a EE environment, but there will be very specific use cases for this. It might be something like a log function or a log bean, where you want to log something. You don't necessarily want to have that influenced by the other transactions that are happening around it. And with the container managed entity manager, the container sort of decided when to start and when to stop it. With an application managed one, you as the developer and your application actually manages the life cycle. So from your entity manager factories where you create it, and your entity manager closes where you close it. If you want to use it in the E environment, you inject it via the persistence unit, and that actually injects an entity manager factory into your class or into your bean. So if we go and look here, which I opened up earlier, you can see there we've got a persistent unit. We give it the unit name we want to inject, and that actually injects an entity manager factory into your bean, and then use that factory to instantiate your entity manager, same way you would in a normal SE application. And the application managed transaction one can either use JTA or it can use the normal resource local. Although using it in a bean might prove difficult. So the other bit I just want to talk about today, talking about persistence transaction management. So in the objectives, transaction management is only like right at the end but you need to understand transactions, understand the persistent context, and when it gets started, and when something is detached, and when you can merge and all that type of stuff. So I'm just going to have a few slides on that, and when we look at it again, like at the end of the course, won't spend as much time on it. So there's three sort of things around transactions and the persistent context that you need to know. So first one is transaction synchronization, and that is when we actually go and register the persistent context with a transaction and make sure that persistent context has got the same state as the transaction we're registering it with. So that's synchronization, synchronizing it. Then association is actually binding a persistent context to a transaction, and that's when we start up a new entity manager in a, let's say in a bean, and that bean then becomes part of some other JTA transaction. That's association. And propagation is sort of a process of sharing a persistent context. So in a Java E environment, a container, you can only have one persistent context per persistence unit. So if you're going to start up another entity manager is going to use that same persistent context, it's going to share it. So that's propagation. And these transactions and the way the transactions, whatever status those transactions are, is going to sort of say, you know, what is new, what is changed, when entities get removed, and so on, when that transaction commits to the database or synchronizes with the database. Let's see, what else? I said determines lifetime of the persistent context, and once a persistent context is linked to a transaction or associated with a transaction, it doesn't matter if it's a JTA transaction, if it's a local transaction, if it's a container managed entity, it doesn't matter how that transaction got instantiated. Once a persistent context is linked to a transaction, all of them behave the same way. Like from the first week, the available ones are resource, local, and JTA. So it's actually when you're going to set up your persistence unit, you're going to define what type of transaction management your bean is going to be using. So if we go and look at a demo from last week, we had our SE environment. When we actually set up our persistence unit, we're going to define the transaction type that we want to use. So we say transaction type is equal to resource local or JTA. And I said the application manager. So application manager, I said, can use both, but container manager can only use JTA. And that's about it. So just looking at how transactions match in with persistent context and when they start and stop. It says, so for transactions called persistent context, the persistent context is tied to the lifecycle of the transaction. And they say that when it's transaction scope, that persistent context is created lazily. So even if you create an entity manager, so with like last week and even one of the questions in the first week's review, is when you create the entity manager, it creates a persistent context. But in a container managed one, it creates it lazily. So it'll only go and create that persistent context when it's required for a method. So if you're actually going to persist something or you're going to remove something, then it's going to see, listen, then the entity manager is going to look and see, listen, have I got a persistent context? If I don't, let me go and create one. If we're going to create a persistent context, it's going to look and see, listen, is there an active transaction or not? If there isn't, I'm going to start a transaction. Can I start a transaction? Can't I start a transaction? So they say it's going to be lazily invoked. And then when that persistent context exits or when it finishes, that data or something gets propagated to the database. One thing though, if you aren't familiar with EJBs and beans and transaction management there, like I said, really read up on that because you have to know how that works. So you have to know when a transaction is going to be active in a bean and when it isn't going to be active. Something like if you've got transaction management on a bean and it's container managed, and you set the attribute as was it not supported, it means that it's not going to create its own transaction. So in that case, you can't really use JPA in there unless you're going to start it yourself. The container isn't going to start it at all. Then we've got an extended persistence context that's tied to your stateful session bean. So it's going to use JTA as well. The main difference is that that gets eagerly loaded. So as soon as your stateful session bean gets created, that persistent context is going to be created as well. And that can lead to problems. And like I said, that's sort of one of the things where persistent context sort of can mess you around, is if you've got a stateless session bean that's using transaction scope persistence, is already linked to a transaction, and you can go and instantiate a stateful session bean, which is using extended persistent context. It's going to want to join or create its own persistent context. But in a container managed environment, you can't have more than one persistent context for that. So that's going to create a clash. So there are workarounds for that. And if you actually go and look for the actual certification course, you don't need to know this, but there's a whole section in Chapter 6 about managing extended persistent context and how you can do that. So one of the ways is if you have an EJB bean there, it's container managed, is to say it requires a new transaction every time you hit that bean. So that will mean that it won't propagate a transaction from a stateless bean or a servlet into your stateful bean either. So you can go and look at that. Then just looking at application managed persistent context as it relates to the JTA. So in this bit that gets synchronized with the JTA, if you open application managed one, it'll just see, well, is there a transaction currently, and it'll just join it. If there isn't, then you actually have to go and tell it to join that transaction. Unlike container managed, with application managed persistent context, you can have as many as you want running there. And the main thing with application managed persistent context is that it's not necessarily going to join it automatically. So the one thing is, if you create a persistent context and it's already a transaction going, so just go to the code here. So if I'm inside this specific bean here, because by default this bean is container managed and it's going to require a transaction, any method that I call in will already have a transaction. So when I create this entity manager, when it gets injected, there will already be an entity. So when I try and use it, it'll already be a transaction up and running. So I'll just join it. But if this specific bean wasn't container managed, it was bean managed, or at a container managed transaction with an attribute that didn't create a transaction, it means I'll actually have to go and say, listen here, here's a transaction running, join it. And that's where we'll actually do the join transaction call on there. And then the last one is the resource local transactions. So those are the ones we saw with the SE type demo. And so that's explicitly controlled by applications. So you sort of say when the transaction starts, when it ends. And you do this for your persistence and entity transactions. So if you're using your JPA, you're not going to use your normal JDBC transactions, because then that sort of you're not using the JPA. So if you're going to be doing the JPA to use the transactions, then you have to access that transaction for your entity transaction, and that sort of mimics the normal user transaction from your JTA interface. So you'll have your begin, your commit, your rollback, set rollback, all that type of stuff. And that's sort of a lot about entity managers. So like I said, sort of really go and reach out to 6 and play around, create your own little container managed one. And I've put a let me show the demo and discuss it. Let's see if there's any questions. Nope. All right, so I'm not going to go through a application managed demo again. I said, so if we've done this, we did this last week. So for an application managed normal SE environment, you use your persistence class as a bootstrap to go and create your entity manager factory. And from there, you can go and create your manager. Give your persistent unit name on your factory when you create it. From there, you've got your entity manager, and you do what you need to do with it. So like here, like I said with JTA local, you use that get transaction to get your entity transaction from there, and then you can do your begin and commit and roll back. What do you need to do this? So, and because we're controlling it for this, you don't have to go and say entity manager.close, anything like that. And just looking at the persistent XML, you can see we've got a transaction type, resource local. So you can use JTA here if you want, but that means you're going to need to use Jindy to actually inject a transaction, a user transaction into your class. So you're going to have some container manager somewhere. So I actually wanted to show you is using JPA like a container or an EJB. So this is this exact same demo that we did last week, where we've got the department and employee classes. So it's exactly the same thing. I use that as a starting point. Only difference is I've changed this to actually run inside Tommy. So I've got a singleton which I'm exposing as a RESTful service, and I'm going to inject some beans into that. And on this, I've also just got the data that I initialized the same way as we did with the SE one. So this will just initialize all that. So to get this up and running, let's say I'm using Tommy. The POM file, I'm just pulled in all the Tommy tools and so on. One thing that couldn't get working, and that's just because of the Derby embedded database, the way it works, you can have one connection at a time, is I had to use Hibernate to get this working. If I use Eclipse Link, it just didn't work. I couldn't use it with Derby. If I use the normal in-memory database, it works fine, but Derby just couldn't work. So the only thing I changed is to use Hibernate. Set up Tommy, set up a resource in there. So in the Tommy configuration folder, Tommy, set that up, database, set up the class path using Maven, database create true, username, password, that type of stuff. And then in the persistence XML, one thing that's different from last week is we actually have to give it a JTA data source. So previous week, the other one, we actually defined the whole connection string and all that. And using a configuration, we just use a normal data source, which is defined in your GIND, and that gets pulled into there. And the important thing, our transaction type is set to JTA. All right, so we've got our normal little test control here, this RESTful service. I'm injecting it to user transaction I want to use, and I've got a container transaction bean. So container transaction bean is a normal stateless bean, nothing fancy about it. We inject our persistent context using persistent context attribute, get our entity manager, and then from entity manager we go and find some department employee for that we've passed in, then we actually go and link that employee to that department. The one thing that I just want to point out here is I do the initialization on the post construct here, but for the people who did the EJB certification will remember that your post construct method runs in an undefined transaction context. So we don't actually have a transaction here, so to cheat it, I actually inject a user transaction and I just sort of begin and commit it inside there. So if we start this up, let's set up a little few Maven goals on Eclipse here that does a clean, a package, and then starts the Tommy server. I've put this on GitHub, and I'll just send out the link to the basic one, not the specific one, just a little basic one that I set up, so you can play around with that as well. So let's start it up, and then I'm just going to use Postman to just do the REST calls. So we're just in this normal list call. That just goes and pretty much as a query on the database, this brings me back all my employees. Then I go and say, okay, well, link my employees to things. So we're going to link this Captain Nemo to a different department. So I go to link, send, that links them to the Scala department. So nothing fancy there. So that's your normal transaction bean, and your sort of container managed transaction scoped entity manager is one you'll probably use 98% of the time. There'll be very specific use cases to use extended, and the fact that extended is linked to a stateful session bean, which you're not going to use too many stateful session beans in any way, means you're not going to use that too often anyway. Then just looking at stateful beans, so the reason for using this extended one, and the one that we do is different here, is we've got a department manager bean here. So it sort of represents a stateful bean that's a department. We're going to manage the department for that. So we're going to inject into our servlet, like we've done here. We've got our department bean, so we've injected it there. And we're going to not have much of a conversational state. Where is that? But we've sort of set up the service, so we're going to rename a department. So we've sort of set up the service where you can, let's say that department manager, you can go and add employees to it, maybe change the name, set the address or projects that department work on. So you sort of have some sort of conversational state like that, and you don't want to necessarily go and have a commit every time, because like I said, when it commits, a persistent context is sort of cleaned up and all your entities get detached. So let's say you had a call here where we go and we change the name of the department, and then we go and add, let's say, employees to the department. after we've changed the name, because that transaction would have been committed on our stateful bean if it wasn't extended, that department will become detached. The reason it'll become detached is because we've actually got an instance of it in here. So it'll become detached, which means anything after that first change won't be persisted at all. If you go and play around with the OCEJPA little demo code, there's a nice little thing that shows how that works. I didn't feel like doing all that typing to show it. I'm lazy like that sometimes. So what's going to happen is if you actually go and call this department, and the main difference is here, we're just saying it's extended there. Otherwise, it works exactly the same as any other bean. And the main thing is we've got a remove method here, because that's the only way this persistent context that gets created or that this entity manager gets links to know it's done. That's because if we're going to call this remove method. Yeah. So if I go to Postman now and I do this, what did I call it? Rename? I'll double check. So we'll call rename there, yeah. So then we go and we change that department name to Groovy. So not a lot of excitement of looking at watching data change, unfortunately. It's just like a step up from watching paint dry. So I really recommend, so that's what I sort of say, that sort of helps you play around, not just watch me do it, but if you actually go and sort of try and see what happens with the different things, see if you can simulate all those different bits. And then if I actually go and call done, and it'll tell that stateful bean that we're done. So not a lot of excitement there. And then last thing I just want to show is the application transaction bean. So using application managed entity manager. So I said main difference is we inject it via the persistence unit. We actually get an entity manager instead of the actual entity. Entity manager factory instead of an entity manager. Then what I've just done is in my post construct, I just go and say, go and get me my entity manager. And of course do this anywhere else. And what this thing does is the same as the list employees in our test controller, except it's doing it through our persistence unit. One thing this mentioned, that the reason that you can only have one persistence unit in a container managed environment is that if you're going to be, if you've got different beans calling into that persistent context, and you have different persistent contexts, if one bean updates, let's say a department name, the other bean isn't going to know about it. So, but if they share that persistent context, all the beans will know about it. So that's sort of why in the container managed environment there can only be one persistent context. Otherwise there will be no way, or it'll be very difficult to sort of know that this bean actually updated the department name, and then that updated department name will be reflected in another bean. So that's sort of why there's only one. So if I go and call this list from bean, and so it pretty much works exactly the same. So no surprises there. And I say that's it. So the important thing, and sort of I found a lot more. Yeah, that'll break in a cluster. Yeah. The other thing also is I found that easier sort of playing around with it and actually seeing how those different transactions work and seeing if you can simulate an extended transaction, a transaction scope, see if you can get it working. So go and read chapter 6, but definitely go and play around with the EJB beans and seeing how the transactions are propagated through there and when it's detached and when it works and doesn't work. Might be easier if you use MySQL for that. So the thing with Derby is because we're using an embedded database there in the container, you don't have one connection to it. So if you actually want to use something like Squirrel or DBeaver, you can't connect to it to see what's happening inside the database. So the last little bit for today is looking at the entity lifecycle. Remember, sort of from the EJB course, we had a lot of life cycles. So at least with this one, we've only got one life cycle. And that's sort of looking at the life cycle of the entity. So entity can be new, managed, detached, or removed. So an entity starts off as new if you haven't done anything with it. So that's when you new up an entity. Your normal, the way you will instantiate any class. When you new it up, it gets managed once you persist it. So if you actually go and persist that entity, so even if you've marked a class as an entity, if you haven't persisted it, it isn't managed. So once it is managed, it means that this specific entity, when this is going to be committed or flushed to the database, that entity it's changes or if it's new, it's going to be written to the database. It can be removed. So if you call remove, it actually takes it out of your persistent context. So that means, not doesn't take it out of your persistent context. It means that once that context gets flushed or the transaction gets committed, that entity, whatever it represented in the database, is going to be deleted. One thing that we haven't done it this week, and I think we're doing it in 2 weeks, is collections. If you are going to remove entities, be aware of the hierarchy that they're in, the relationships they've got, because the JPA doesn't actually worry too much about those transactions. It'll apply the rules, but it's not clever enough to go calculate and work out the way that all your relationships fit together and when it should cascade and how it's going to cascade. So just be aware of it when we do collections and relationships. Then we'll look at this again. So when you're removing anything, just be aware of the relationships involved in that. Then from managed, go to detached. So it will be detached whenever your entity manager calls the clean, the flush method, or when the transaction is committed or rolled back. So that'll mean it'll be detached. And you've got to refresh as well. We'll just keep it managed. So refresh function will just go and get and synchronize your data in your database or your data store with your persistent context. And if something is detached, you can use the merge function as well to get it back into a managed state. And depending on which state an entity is in, it's going to sort of tell you what you can do with it, what you can't do with it, and also what the entity manager can do with it. So these are just the stages. Some more explanations. I'm not going to go through that again. So looking at entity manager, so we've got our entity in the different life cycles, and the entity manager changes the whatever state those life cycles are in, and that sort of operates on the persistent context. So sort of defining to work on those entities inside the persistent context, we use the entity manager. And there's sort of two main categories for the operation. So the one is transaction association, and that's really just your get transaction method and seeing if there is a transaction, and your entity lifecycle management. And that's sort of our persist, remove, clean, all that type of stuff. So for a persist function, and for these functions, the main thing you need to know for these functions, which ones can be called outside of a transaction. So a persist and remove operations cannot be called outside a existing transaction. So if you're going to try and persist it and there's no transaction, you're going to get a transaction required exception. So a persist call actually tells takes the entity and takes it from a new to a managed state. And then when that persistent context gets flushed or the transaction gets committed, that's going to be inserted into the database. If a entity is already persisted and you persist it again, JPA is just going to ignore it. Reason you might want to do that is if there's any relationships on that entity that you want to persist as well, that'll happen. And if that entity is actually not new and you try and persist it and the JPA provider catches you out, it'll be like, hey, this entity exists, exception is going to be thrown. Then, of course, if you want to remove it, that's if you want to delete something out of the database. Tell it you want to remove it. Like I said, be aware of relationships there. And once again, this needs to be called inside an active transaction. Then you can go and find a entity as well, and this is actually going to locate it on its primary key. One caveat here is if you can use the find method outside of a transaction, but if you do use it outside of a transaction, it means that that entity will be detached. So you can't do a find and then update that entity and think it's going to be persisted to the database if it's outside of a transaction. And it's pretty logical. The reason for that is, if a new transaction starts and it's not part of that, wasn't part of that persistent context, then there's no way that it's going to be a bit difficult for the JPA provider to just know that this entity needs to be updated with whatever data we got from the database. Another method that's pretty much the same as a find. So a lot of times you might do a find just to get the primary key of an entity, something like that. So you can also just do a get reference. In that instance, it's the same as a find, but it doesn't bring back the entire entity, all the data. It just brings back the entity, and you only have access. We'll only get data when you try and access the primary key. Important thing to remember is it actually just returns a proxy for that, so it'll try and get it out of the cache. And with a normal find method, if it doesn't find that entity, it just returns a null. With a get reference, it'll actually throw an exception. So it'll return the entity not found exception. So just be aware of that. Then the bits that sort of interact directly on the persistent context is the flush, refresh, and clear. So a flush is telling the provider, listen here, I want you to commit. With a flush, it might not necessarily commit immediately, and depending on the provider, whether it does it eagerly or lazily, it might do a flush when you don't expect it. So just be aware of that, know how your provider, whatever you're using, how it works. But it generally just forces a commit on your persistent context. Then the refresh is, I wouldn't say the opposite, but it sort of takes whatever data is in your database and resynchronizes it back to your entity. So anything that is detached won't be updated, but anything that's managed will get whatever data is there. And you generally want to just go and do this whenever you want to, you feel like it. I say the specific use case for this is if you've got long running optimistic transactions, and you don't want necessarily have stale data in there, so it'll be more like look up and you're like, listen, well, this data, we're not too much worried about it being locked out or stuffing it around for some other transaction that's running. And then the other one is clear. So with the clear is the same as flush, except with the clear we're detaching all our entities, but we're not synchronizing with the database. It's not sending any data to the database. So it just detaches all your entities that are in your persistent context. And then sort of the detachment and merging, say sort of one of the like the persistent context and when it exists and doesn't exist is one of the pains with ORM. When an entity is detached is another one, and merging it back. And this generally sort of happens when you cross tiers, or if you've got some funky relationship between beans. You always need to be aware when something is going to be detached, because otherwise you're going to have some unexpected results when you think something should be updated and isn't, and you can't figure it out because you're setting it. It might be that an entity is detached. So for that, you need to know all these rules for when an entity is detached. So it's whenever a transaction scope persistent context commits, if an application manager is closed. So I'm not going to go through all of that. We've mentioned some of these already. And the other thing that we haven't done yet is when it gets detached. So we've actually got a detach method on Entity Manager. So it's the opposite of persist. So persist will actually make it managed. Detach will make it unmanaged. So the transaction gets rolled back. And also when an entity is serialized. So whenever you're going to pass an entity across the wire, so from one bean to another bean, or from one JVM to another JVM, whenever that serialization happens, it's going to detach it. And of course, once something is detached, you want to be able to merge it back. So for the certification exam, you don't need to know the different strategies for managing this and what's best practice. So you just need to know that you can merge it back and what happens when you merge. So definitely, there's a whole nice section in the book of examples on merging strategies and how to avoid detachment, because detachment isn't great and you should try and avoid it if you can. It just makes things difficult. And merging as well, and so different strategies of merging and different patterns you can use there. Okay, so if you want to merge an entity that's been detached back into your persistent context, you use the merge operation. One thing to understand is when you use the merge operation is that that entity that you're passing in there, that entity nothing happens with that. All that happens is your provider goes and checks and says, listen, for this entity that you've passed in, have I got an instance of it already in my persistent context? So using the primary key there, the identity of it. If it exists, what it does is it goes and fetches that one that's already managing and copies the state of the one that you passed in into this existing one, and then returns the one that's already managed. So the one that is detached stays detached. It's just not going to come back. If you're going to merge it in and the provider says, listen, while this entity doesn't exist, it creates a new one and then copies that state across. So the one that you pass in, the detached entity, will stay detached. It will never become detached, attached or merged or managed because you passed it in. One of the things again to look at there is cascading relationships. So when you look at relationships, I'll mention it again. Like I said, the book has some really nice examples of how this works. So for merging a detachment, you need to know when an entity is going to be detached. And for merging, you need to know how merging is going to work. I say its main important thing there is a detached entity doesn't become managed because you merged. That actually returns a new entity that is managed. Okay, so it's going to quickly do a detached and merging demo. So for this, in this container transaction bin, I've got an update employee which actually sent an employee to this bin. So it's going to be serialized. Well, it's not really going to be serialized, but I'm going to pretend that it's serialized. It's going to send it to you, and I'm going to merge this, and then I'm going to change the name of that employee to Admiral Stewart. Spell it wrong as well. No, that's correct. Admiral Stewart. So this will be this Captain Nemo will become Admiral Stewart. But the first way I'm going to do this is I'm actually just going to update the detached one that I'm inserting. So even though I've called the merging, so this shouldn't update anything at all. So just look at test control. All I did here is I just used the employee, the normal query to go and get the employee out of here, and then pass it in, and then I'm just going to list the employees again. But because I'm not using the new one that gets returned, that's not going to update anything. So if I go here and I do the, what do I call it? Employee. No, it's not employee. It is employee. What do I call this? It is employee. Yeah. I should stop doubting myself. So call employee. You can see it didn't update it at all. So the reason is because that detached entity we pass in doesn't get managed. We have to actually get one back. So if I just go and fix up my code here, just here. Okay, so this merge statement returns a new entity for us if it doesn't exist, or an updated entity if it's already managed. Let's go and say employee, the employee. It's an important employee, it's the employee. I think I say the employee instead of employee. So that's the main thing to remember. It's this merge returns a entity for you. Whether it's new one or existing one, the detached one stays detached. Let's start up Tommy again. So after watching paint dry, watching database update, and then you get watching Tommy start. That's sort of the levels of boringness. Let me just do some of these things again. So it's going to call list again. So we've got our Captain Nemo there. Then go and say employee. You can see it's an updated to Admiral Stewart. Simple and easy. So the persistent context and when things are detached and managed, that's sort of very, very important concepts to sort of know and how they work when it comes to JPA. So for the certification, you need to know it, but just for general day-to-day working, that is something that's really important and that can mess you around. Whether you're using JPA, whether you're working in the .NET environment, we're using something like Hibernate. I've seen this bite a few people before as well. Are there any questions? Today's session. I hope I can answer it. Not too many? Okay. All right. So, quiz for this weekend again, 10 questions. We're now to complete, opens at 3. We've updated the time on the server, so that should be fine. So if you want to see if it's open now. Next week, we're looking at relationships. So this week, it's reading. We've got some bits of relationship, especially on persist and remove and how the cascading works there. So you might as well read it because you're going to need to write for relationships, so don't skip over it. Next week, we're going to look at relationships, one-to-one, many-to-many, one-to-many, many-to-one, all those okies. And then for the specification, only the 2.9 and 2.10. So a lot less reading for next week. I also think next weekend's review quiz will fall on the weekend we've got our party, BBD party, happening there. So we'll probably extend the review quiz to the Monday night. I don't think we're going to expect anybody to write it on Sunday after the party. Nobody might write. Well, nobody that went to the party might write. Okay, so and the attendance keyword for today is manager. Let's put that there if anybody near it. Manager. If an oval say management. Manager. That's the keyword for today. All right, so there's no other questions, then guys must go forth and conquer. I'll see you guys next week. Cheers, bye.